The clash begins in the dust. 100 Vikings, 10,000 Mongols. On parchment, that isn't a battle, it's a death sentence. Yet legend whispers they stood their ground anyway. This was no ordinary clash of swords. It was the collision of Norse steel, honed in icy seas and shield walls, against the most terrifying cavalry force the world had ever seen. The Mongols weren't just warriors, they were a machine, an empire of horsemen that swallowed kingdoms whole. So here's the question that tears at history. What happens when a brotherhood bred in loyalty and iron faces an empire built on fear and deception? Stay with me, because the answer isn't what you think. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture longships sliding onto English beaches, monasteries in flames, silver ripped from abbeys. That's true, but it's only half the story. The other half? Almost no one remembers it. Imagine them instead steering their ships east, along rivers so black and winding they looked endless. These weren't the salty oceans of Norway. These were the Dnieper and the Volga, rivers that carved across the forests and swamps of what is now Russia and Ukraine. Here, the Norse weren't just raiders. They were called Varangians, foreigners who became warriors for hire, traders, and sometimes even princes' most trusted bodyguards. Think of Kiev and Novgorod, early power centers of the Rus. Local rulers there carved their authority not from castles on cliffs, but from cities nestled in rivers and forests. They needed loyal, hard men to guard treasure, defend borders, and crush rivals. And who better than Vikings, already famous for discipline and ferocity? These bands became known as the Druzhina, a prince's personal war band, not levies of farmers, not peasants dragged from fields. These were professionals, brothers in arms who swore to fight and die with the man who paid them. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it echoes the Varangian Guard of Byzantium. The axe-wielding giants who stood beside emperors in Constantinople weren't an accident. They were part of the same pattern. Outsiders who owed loyalty only to each other and their sworn leader. And here's the key. Medieval armies weren't measured only in size. They were measured in whether they held when things went bad. Local militias broke and scattered when pressed. Varangians didn't. They locked shields, ground forward, and bled until told otherwise. That reputation made them priceless. If you want a modern comparison, think of them as special forces. Small in number, trained by seas and storms, deadly not because of quantity, but because of unbreakable cohesion. And that's the exact kind of men this story is about. Not a great army, not an empire, just 100 Vikings, forgotten in chronicles, whispered of in legends, planted directly in the path of history's deadliest storm. But to understand the storm, you have to see the riders themselves. First you hear it, a thunder of hooves, 10,000 strong. Then the dust rises. Across the open steppe comes not an army of men, but a moving tide. Riders blurred into one shape, galloping so smoothly it looks like the earth itself is rolling forward. This wasn't like the lumbering armies of Europe. No wagons, no peasants dragging supplies. Every Mongol warrior carried his own bow, his own food, his own spare horses. They could strike when no one expected, vanish before anyone reacted. But speed wasn't their only weapon. It was discipline. What you saw was not chaos. It was choreography. Maneuvers drilled until thousands of horsemen moved as one machine. And their greatest trick? The false retreat. A few riders turn, pretend to panic, flee. The enemy, smelling victory, rushes forward. That's when the trap closes. Fresh riders cut off the flanks, and the broken host swings back around. Suddenly the victors are surrounded, arrows blotting the sky, their pride sealing their doom. Whole coalitions fell to this theatre. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, princes of Rus rushed forward in triumph, only to be crushed, encircled, annihilated. Now, set that beside the Viking way of war. Norsemen thrived in the shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. one body refusing to move. Where others scattered, they clung tighter. Where others chased, they stayed. The Mongols lived by deception and distance. The Vikings lived by grit and proximity. And that difference, those two philosophies, are what collided in a river valley one day, when 100 shields braced themselves against a living storm. 100 shields pressed together, edges biting into the earth of a narrow river valley. Across the field, riders wheel their horses in a dark cloud of dust. You can almost feel the silence just before motion. The moment when the breath of the horses and the rasp of leather fills the air. Then comes the charge. The Vikings know that if they spread apart, they die. So they stand shoulder to shoulder, each man locking his shield with the one beside him. Their tactic is simple: a wall. A barrier designed not to move, not to chase, but to absorb the fury of what's coming. The shield wall was never meant to conquer in numbers. It was meant to hold, to turn the energy of a charging enemy into dead weight. And in this valley, there is no room for space or gaps. The Mongols hate walls. Their power comes from motion, from harassing and circling until a line breaks on its own. A frontal strike is a waste of men and horses, so they start the way they always do. Bows raised, the sky filling with arrows. You can hear the pounding of hooves mix with the whistle of shafts cutting air. The Vikings crouch behind overlapping planks, iron rims catching the thrum of impact. Arrows bite into wood, clatter against helmets, but the line holds. This is no infantry of peasants scattering after the first volley. These men treat each arrow storm as nothing but weather to outlast. They do not run, they do not chase. They become the opposite of everything the Mongols expect to fight. Still, solid, stubborn. And that begins to change the rhythm of the battle. But the horsemen adjust, circling, darting in, loosing volleys, then slipping back before a sword can touch them. It's a dance designed to wear down patience, to sow doubt. Yet when a Viking breaks forward a step, he is dragged back into place by his brother in line. Discipline makes the difference here. The Vikings know that chasing a rider leads only to death, so the wall holds tight while hooves thunder around them. To the Mongols, it feels like trying to force smoke into a sealed jar. It resists in ways that are unnatural. What comes next is where the clash of systems sharpens. Mongol riders thrive on distance. Vikings thrive on touch. The closer the fight, the more the advantage tips to those heavy axes and swords. It's like a heavyweight boxer being forced into a wire cage with a grappler who won't let go. The Mongols have reach, movement, and endless darts. Once pressed into a space too tight to maneuver, they lose their breath. And terrain suddenly matters. In a broad plain, cavalry can wheel back 100 times, firing as they turn. But here you've got rivers hemming in movement, trees closing the edges, soft marsh under hoof. One slip, one stumble, and a horse goes down. A riverbank narrows the angle of attack. It forces riders into channels instead of endless rings. For once, the land betrays them. To foot soldiers trained to stand in mud and snow, heavy ground means little. To a horse army, it's a crack in their design. Now imagine the effect of that. 100 men don't need to kill thousands. They need to slow the rhythm, to make horses hesitate, to make arrows fall against a shield before the next shift of ground robs the riders of speed. What if, for just a moment, that shield wall threw timing off enough to cause collisions, panic, even confusion among the riders pressing in? Suddenly noise and dust work against the cavalry instead of the defenders. Of course, no wall is truly unbreakable. Arrows still find gaps, spears still push openings, men still fall. The Vikings know this. But the key isn't perfection. It's survival long enough to force the Mongols to try something beyond their first set of tricks. For each moment the wall stands, the cost to the horsemen grows, and the rhythm leans away from the unstoppable storm. So what you see here is not an invincible line. It's a line that buys time by refusing to break. 100 shields, battered and splintered, force a vast cavalry machine to ask new questions. And the Mongols, masters of adaptation, are not used to hesitation. But then came the real question. When old patterns failed, would clever adaptation or sheer grit decide who walked away from that field? The Mongols begin their old game. Horses wheel, a few riders break away, dust surges skyward. To every army before, this meant victory. The enemy was breaking. Princes had ridden forward at moments like this, eager to claim glory. And then they died, encircled, crushed. The feigned retreat was their perfect weapon. But this time, silence. Inside the shield wall, the Vikings don't move. Not a step forward, not a cheer. Only shields pressed tighter, spears angled like teeth. The horsemen wait for the chase that never comes. The riders swing wide, arrows fly from both sides. A militia would shatter, but the Vikings shift into a circle. Every side covered, no weak point exposed. The Mongols circle faster, hooves thunder, shafts hammer wood. Yet still, the wall does not chase. A rider drifts too close, an axe flashes, he's dragged down. Horses swerve, timing cracks. For once, the trap does not spring shut. The bait is ignored, and the illusion of control begins to fray. Legend says hesitations spread, a retreat stretched too long. Dust hid direction, riders collided, and at the center, the wall still stood. The field is quiet now. Where dust storms churned and hooves thundered, only the breeze over grass remains. The Mongols are pulling back, their formations drifting eastward like shadows dissolving into the horizon. For the men inside the shield wall, it feels unreal. 100 survive where none were meant to stand. The air tastes of iron, the shields are cracked, but the line has not been erased. In the silence after chaos, it almost feels as though time has paused. To ask how such an outcome could even exist. No one expected this. Think about it. Entire coalitions of princes and nomad allies had fallen to Mongol tricks in a single afternoon. Yet here, with no banners of kingdoms, no layers of command, only 100 men tied by loyalty, the wave broke against the wall and then fell back. That was not supposed to happen. The Mongol pattern was flawless. Scout, surround, retreat, collapse the enemy's will, then strike again. But when will did not crack, their rhythm faltered. To understand why this rippled out, you need to remember how the Mongols thought of war. They weren't just raiders looting for plunder. They analyzed. They learned. Every setback, even the smallest, was studied until it could never happen again. If a bridge collapsed, they brought engineers next time. If a fortress lasted too long, siegecraft improved. So what must it have meant when a group too small to threaten them had nonetheless exposed a weakness? Even legends carry lessons. And this one whispered something dangerous. That cohesion could blunt the storm. But while the Mongols treated defeat as information, the Rus treated survival as legend. Chronicles in that land rarely recorded battles simply as outcomes. They were stories, woven larger than life, shaping memory long after the details faded. A tale of 100 warriors refusing to fall wasn't just a note in history. It was a symbol carved into identity. To a people crushed again and again by invasion, the thought that flesh and wood could force horsemen to retreat gave hope. For them, this was less about the bodies on the ground, and more about the image of the wall still standing. And reputation mattered as much as swords. In medieval war, fear could rout an army before the first blow. The Mongols mastered this truth, arriving with news of past victories that broke the will of towns before the siege began. But when rumor spread that one small band had held out and survived, it inserted a splinter in the narrative. If even the greatest machine could hesitate before a shield wall, then the impossible was not entirely impossible. In simple numbers, nothing had changed. In fear and memory, everything had. Here's the twist. You might think 100 men can't shift history, yet they can shift story. And story bends memory as strongly as fact. Armies march on bread and horses, yes, but they also march on belief. A community convinced no resistance is possible will surrender without a fight. A community told that even a handful can resist long enough to scar the storm begins to think differently. That's how myths turn into power. For the Mongols, it was a reminder. Even a perfect engine of war has limits. For the Rus, it became a torch lit in darkness, proof that backbone could matter more than numbers. The final meaning is simple. Even the sharpest blade recoils when it strikes a target that will not fracture. And that returns us to you, because the question isn't about Vikings or Mongols anymore. The question is what still holds. When the odds are stacked, when the storm builds, and when you are the one standing in the line that refuses to yield. History doesn't always bend to numbers. Sometimes, it bends to reputation carved in legend. The chronicles in Rus turned survival stories into cultural memory, where the act of standing firm mattered as much as winning. 100 warriors holding fast became larger than the battle itself. That image, unyielding, immovable, was the real weapon. So now the question falls to you. Would you keep your place in that shield wall if 10,000 riders bore down? That's the power of legend. It forces us to imagine ourselves inside it. If you've traveled with me through this clash of steel and storm, don't stop here. Subscribe, join the journey, and dive deeper into the forgotten battles and hidden crossroads of history. Because the past is never just behind us. It waits in the stories we choose to keep alive.